Alright, so in this final lesson, we're going to learn how we can render out our final animation from Maya. Okay, so at this point our scene is fully lit. Everything is set up to be rendered out the way that we want. Now we just need to set off our final render. So let's go into the render settings and we'll make a few last minute quality adjustments before we set this off. So if you recall from one of the earlier lessons, I mentioned that I always like to work with a sampling level of 0, maybe a sampling level of 1 as I'm testing things out, but then when I'm ready to shoot out my final animation, remove all of this aliasing artifacts, then typically I like to bump this up to something like 2, maybe 3, but for most situations 2 is pretty acceptable. Now we need to go over to the Common tab and start to set up a few things as far as the overall output format, where these images are going to be saved, what the image is going to be saved, and so on. So the first thing that we have is the file name prefix. So this is really going to be the name of the animation that we render out from Maya. So in this case, let's call it something like ship final. So ship final. There we are. And as soon as we hit enter, we can actually see a little preview of what this image is going to look like and where this is going to be saved. Now, at the moment, this is going to save this image out as basically one single image. Now, we really don't want that because we want to render out our entire animation. So in the image format, we can choose how this is going to be rendered out. Now, here's something that you need to keep in mind. This is something that sort of confuses a lot of people. I know that this confused me when I first started using Maya, and that's the fact that Maya doesn't allow you to render out any sort of a movie. So you can't render out a QuickTime, you cannot render out an AVI, you won't find those formats available anywhere in here. So what this is going to do instead is render out a single image for every single frame of my animation. So in this case I have a 200 frame animation, so I'm going to wind up with 200 individual images. And that's actually sort of a good thing when you think about it. Because what would happen normally if Maya allowed you to render out a QuickTime or an AVI, if your render were to crash halfway through, then that means you've lost all of that rendering work. And the next time you render, you're going to have to start all over again. But with an image sequence, you have a new image for every single frame that you render out. So if at any point, let's say your render crashes halfway through, that means you still have all of the images that you've rendered out up to that point. So you could just relaunch Maya, tell the render to start again at that point where it crashed, and continue on. You don't ever have to worry about losing any of your rendering work. So this is actually a really, really good thing to have. Now below this, again, at the moment this is going to render out just a single individual frame or a single individual image. What we need to do is tell this to render out some sort of a sequence or a number of frames. Now we can choose exactly how this is going to render out, so it can be name.number.extension. So in this case it could be shipfinal.1.tga, where that number represents the frame number. Or you could flip that around where it's the name of this sequence plus the extension, which is TGA in my case, then the frame number after that. In my case, and for most situations, you would probably want to leave this at name, number, extension. Now back to this Targa format. This is just sort of my personal choice for output format. I find that this gives us a really good balance between a nice high quality image with very little compression, very little noise issues, but it's also a fairly small, fairly compact file, not a really huge overbloated file. So I, just as a matter of personal preference, like to use the Targa format. Now down a little bit further we have the frame range. Now this is the start and end frame. By default, Maya is only set to render about a 10 frame sequence. Now again, in our case, if we take a look at our timeline, our sequence is set to go to about frame 200. So I'm going to make sure I set my start frame, or rather my end frame, at 200. And again, as soon as I enter that, you can see exactly what we're going to get. shipfinal.1.tga is going to be the start, and we're going to finish up with shipfinal.200.tga. Now down below, this is where we choose the renderable camera. Now this is critically important that we choose the right camera to render out from. Otherwise, in a case where you have multiple cameras, like my shot cam, if I set off my render at this point, it's going to render from the perspective cam, which is completely wrong. So always double check this and make sure that you have this set to render from the proper camera. There, believe me, is nothing more frustrating than setting a render off all night and then coming back only to find out that you've forgot to render from the proper camera. Now moving down a little bit further, we have the presets for the image size. So this determines the height and width of the image that's going to be rendered out from Maya. You can set this to anything you want. In my case, I'm going to set this to HD 720, which will give me a 1280 by 720 image. If we take a look at our resolution gate, we can turn that on, and you can see as soon as we change this format, my resolution gate changes to let me see what is going to be rendered inside of that frame. Okay, very good. And that should be pretty much it. Now, the way that we render out our animations from Maya is a little bit different than anything that we've been doing up to this point. What we've been using so far is just this simple little render view. Now, this is what we use if we are going to just be rendering out single individual images and either viewing those in Maya, or if we wanted to save those out just as a single individual image. Now, when it comes to rendering out our animations, we rely on a feature called batch rendering. So batch rendering can be found inside the rendering menu, and over in the render menu, let's go to batch render. Now, if you want, there are some options in here that you can possibly turn on. One feature that I do find to be useful is to disable this render threads, and these are some options that you'll only find if you happen to be using MentalRay as your renderer. But I do typically make it a habit in Maya of disabling this auto render threads and then manually setting this number to match the number of threads that I have. If you're a Windows user and have access to something like the Task Manager, which you can usually just access by right-clicking somewhere on your Start menu, the number of threads that we have here in Maya is usually going to match the number of different cores that you have in your system. In my case, I have 8 cores, so I'm going to set that to 8 threads. Okay, now once we have that set, it's just now simply a matter of setting off a batch render. So once we do this, if you take a look down in your script editor, or down in your Mel line, you can start to see, okay, our batch render has started, and it's now rendering our first frame. And if we open this up, we could actually follow our renders, and we could see exactly where this image is being output, what the progress is on it. At this point, you can see we're at 0%, so it's still in the pre-calculation phase. Okay, and now you can see that we're starting to get some progress going. Now, these first few frames of the animation will probably take quite a little bit of time to render out. And the reason for that is just because we have such a large element that takes up so much of our rendered frame that there's a lot here to calculate. So for these first few frames, at least until the camera starts to pull away, you will probably start to notice that these first few frames render really slow. If at any point in time we realize that maybe we've made a mistake or there's some reason that we need to stop the batch render, we can do that at any point in time by just going up to render and then cancel batch render. So we can stop that. Maya asks if we're sure that we want to cancel the job. Go ahead and click yes. And now my render has stopped. So at this point I can go back, make any changes I need to, and then just set the render off again. Again, if at any point in time, let's say I have maybe 100 frames of animation, which are completely fine, but after frame 100 something started to break, I could let this render up to frame 100, go back, make my changes, and then back in the render settings, just set my start frame to start again at frame 100, and then set my batch render off again. So that way I don't ever have to worry about re-rendering something that's already just fine. Alright, so once that render is complete, if you take a look inside the images directory, which is, again, where Maya is going to output these in your current project folder, you can see here's all of my individual images, and again, I get one Targa file for every single frame. So what I could do is open these up in something like FCheck, which is a small little image viewing application that does come with Maya. Within this FCheck application, I could go in and go to File and then just to simply open up an animation. Let's say if I wanted to view this little sequence. There we go. You just give this just a moment to load up the rendered frames. Okay, there we go. So now you can see here's our Targa sequence loaded up and our final render. Now, one of the nice things about this FCheck is you can take your mouse and actually click and drag while this is playing through and actually sort of scrub through your animation and see if there are any problem frames or anything like that. Okay, very nice. So once you have your individual frames rendered out, what do we start to do with all of these individual images? Let's say if we wanted to make a QuickTime or an AVI out of these. Well, what we'd have to do is take these through some external application that would allow us to bring in an image sequence and then output an AVI or a QuickTime or whatever the case may be. Now, there's a number of different applications that you could use for that. If you have access to Autodesk Composite, which is an application that does come with Maya, you could bring in your image sequence and then output those as whatever you want, QuickTime, AVI, whatever the case may be. If you have Adobe After Effects, you could also do the same thing. Or if you had access to VirtualDub, which is a free application, so this would be a free solution where you could, again, import your image sequence and then output a QuickTime, an AVI, or any number of other formats. So this is now going to bring us to the conclusion of this Introduction to Maya course, where we've had a chance to really build a strong foundation and get a good overview of Maya's toolset and its capabilities. Now from here, we have lots of additional training for you to view depending on which area of Maya you'd actually like to learn more about. If you'd like to learn more about modeling, we have Introduction to Modeling in Maya, where we'll take a little bit more in-depth look at some of the modeling tools found in Maya and really help you become more proficient with those tools. Now, if you'd like to learn more about texturing, we have UV mapping workflows in Maya, texture painting in Maya and Photoshop, utilizing shading networks in Maya. And if you'd like to learn more about rigging and animation, we have Introduction to Character Rigging and Introduction to Animation in Maya. To learn more about particles and other dynamic effects, we have Introduction to Dynamics in Maya. If you'd like to learn more about lighting and rendering, we can refer to you the Introduction to Lighting course, as well as the Introduction to Mental Ray in Maya course. Now, these are just a few of the hundreds of courses that you can now view instantly at digitaltutors.com.